This is a conversation with JP, a writer and researcher and a member of the Hong Kong left and decolonial group Lausan. JP and I spoke about the ongoing protests in Hong Kong and what differentiates them from others. Unlike most other places, for example, Hong Kong in many ways has an expiration date, 2047. This is the date when the one country, two systems arrangement with China might come to an end. This gives an urgency to the protest that is very difficult to imagine for those of us who don't come from this context. In this episode, JP talks to me about the causes and implications of the ongoing protests in Hong Kong. Is it a good thing that they remain leaderless? What does it mean to be a Hong Konger today? And is there room for an expanded and more inclusive definition? How do we start thinking about transnational solidarity and non-sovereign revolutions? You can find an associated blog post to this episode on the website, with a lot of essays and articles for you to read if you want to inform yourself on Hong Kong and its global implications. Okay, here's my conversation with JP from Lausan. If we can start with just quick introductions from your part, if that's okay.
So I'm JP. I'm a member of Lausan, which is a collective of writers, researchers, activists, and artists from Hong Kong and its diasporas. And we're interested in sharing decolonial and left perspectives on Hong Kong. And yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to discuss the Hong Kong protests and all the issues related to it here.
So can we start with contextualization of the ongoing protests? Like, what makes these different from previous ones? Because obviously Hong Kong has seen a few in the past. Were there any signs, maybe in the first weeks or months, that indicated that, this time was different or that kind of thing? And if we can also kind of speak about what are some of the things that you think are being missed on the international scene, or what's missing in this international conversation when it comes to Hong Kong?
I think the protest movement that started in June, or more technically, I guess, in March, but large-scale protests broke out in June of 2019 in Hong Kong, were against the extradition bill that would allow anyone from Hong Kong or living in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China, which has a very notoriously corrupt criminal justice system. And as the police and state repression of those protests escalated, the protest movement evolved into a broader movement for self-determination and democracy and autonomy. I think that when you look at it from that narrow perspective, that is like from just the vantage point of 2019, it's very easy to miss that honestly, the demands of the protests are not super different to the demands of previous protest movements, such as the Umbrella Movement in 2014, because the demand for universal suffrage and democracy is basically the same. More broadly, I think the ongoing protests, which have now taken a bit of a backseat because of the coronavirus, but actually over the weekend broke out again, resulting in a lot of arrests, is all rooted in this longer-term struggle against this perceived erosion of the autonomy of Hong Kong on both legal, political, economic, and social fronts. So the character of the protest movement this time around is quite different in the sense that the strategies and tactics, for example, are quite different to 2014. In 2014, we saw large-scale occupation for about 3 months of the city's central arterial areas. But this time around, we've seen a lot more diversification of the tactics in terms of there's street protests, widespread mobilization in different industries and professions, and outpouring of creative art and music and song, and people working in a lot of different mediums to make their voices heard. A lot more international outreach and attempts to frame the international conversation and coverage about Hong Kong. And also internally, there's this sense of unprecedented unity and solidarity, mostly because in the years after the Umbrella Movement in 2014, there was a lot of rancor and discord between different factions of the broadly anti-establishment side. People disagreed about tactics. Some people wanted more peaceful civil disobedience type tactics. Others believed in more militant action, and some went to jail for it. People also disagreed previously on whether the way out was independence or reform within the current system. People disagreed about what should be the priority in terms of securing electoral wins or, building from the ground up. Just lots of disagreements and a deep feeling of disappointment and sadness and grief that the Umbrella Movement hadn't managed to win any concessions from the government and actually resulted in the arrests and censorship of many. And so all of that has conditioned the response in this movement to be very much focused on building solidarity within ourselves in opposition to what we see as a larger threat. But we can talk about this and the potential limitations because, of course, it's also resulted in a particular attitude towards organizing that is not super inclusive and also is not very tolerant of maybe disagreements that challenge the structure of the movement and this decision making. So, yeah.
Okay. Kind of adding to that, or kind of to get into some of the details, I guess. The movement in Hong Kong is, as far as I can tell, is being described as leaderless. How accurate is it? And if I can maybe get your thoughts on just reflecting on whether this has been efficient so far, or whether there have been discussions, whether on the ground or in the diaspora, online, and so on. Over what the tactics, over how the tactics can be bettered. How can we here as protesters, let's say, how can protesters make these demands actually realized?
I think the leaderlessness of the Hong Kong protest movement currently has to be situated again in this longer history of mobilization, in the sense that basically the last 5 years since the 2014 Occupy Central movement has seen widespread arrests, harsh sentencing of people convicted of having staged riots. All the leaders of the movement in 2014 and also different protests for land rights and also some advocates of independence were sentenced to really long prison sentences for engaging in protest. And so, first and foremost, the leaderlessness was a response to this because of Hong Kongers' deep awareness of the vulnerability that the state can exploit when there are clear and defined targets and leaders of a movement that they can kind of clamp down on and thereby extinguish the momentum of protests. And so with this in mind, I think the original idea of having, quote unquote, no big stage, which is our kind of word for no big leader or no centralized organization coordinating the protests, is so that we can distribute the risk and vulnerability wider. And it also informs how many of us organize anonymously online without any knowledge of each other's professions, names, personal details, because at the end of the day, we know that the state will eventually, and is already starting to, act and enact repercussions for people's political resistance. But then I guess on the second level, on a different level, apart from this, I guess, negative reaction to the previous protests, leaderlessness is also, at least for me and some other people I've spoken to, a way of creating a non-hierarchical and truly democratic system of organizing that's founded on a concept of mutual aid and mutual solidarity. Because I think in order for a leaderless movement to be successful, there has to be somewhat of a trust and faith and good faith that people have in one another, to trust that they will have the same principles and have the same target, but also that they will not sell you out. And this is kind of the second big aspect of the protests, not only leaderlessness, but also this idea of unity. We have this state slogan, I guess, or principle of the movement, that's something translated to like no severing ties, no condemning, and the literal translation is no cutting the mat, but that basically means like no criticism. And that's because we know that infighting and internal discord actually has such an impact on the effective and real strategic and material unfolding of any protest movement. And so on the basis of like good faith and trusting in one another and believing that no matter what strategy we employ, whether that's like people's decision to make art or music or fundraise for like medical and legal supplies or like militant clashes on the street with the police, we're all united by the same goal. And so we don't need a single leader to tell us how we achieve that goal. And so in many ways, I think the Hong Kong example is a really powerful example because it shows the power of a public when it's, you know, truly on one hand backed into a corner with no other viable alternative than to organize in the shadows and organize anonymously. But on the other hand, it's a real refreshing corrective to this individualistic, in many ways, like neoliberal transformation of activism into a point-scoring, self-image-oriented practice that I so often see in European and American and general, like, Western movements, because it's definitely explicitly organized against a cult of personality. And that's what has given it such longevity, because people tap in and out, but there's this general momentum to continue. Sorry for that very long response.
No, not at all. I was actually, like while you were talking, I was thinking of the case in Lebanon, because we had fairly sizable protests in 2015. Back then, the fundamental flaw, which, I mean, I think is generally agreed upon now in retrospect, is that it was way too centralized. It was not just centralized in Beirut, which is a problematic in itself, but it was centralized in the sense that it was actually organized by a handful of individuals. Mm-hmm. Now, I was actually part of the organizing committee, so to speak, in its early weeks, even though my role wasn't particularly important. And it was one of those flaws that I think when 2019 hit, when the October 2019 protests hit, it's almost like we instinctively understood as well that, like, basically this should not happen anymore. And any time since then that we've had attempts either by the government to appoint representatives of the movement, or by the media for sensational reasons to also decide that this person, that person is for some reason a leader in the movement, you've always had lots of people, protesters especially, basically rejecting that. And so far, it hasn't stuck there. There's no leader of the movement. It doesn't mean anything to say that there is any leader in the movement, which I think is definitely a plus. What I haven't seen yet, and it's very interesting that there is this explicit act, I guess, because at the end of the day, it's a like you said, that there's an explicit instinct, I guess, against this kind of tendency, which I find very, very interesting. And I think it definitely speaks to why the protests in Hong Kong have definitely inspired many of us elsewhere. I had a question about, so it's kind of related to that to a certain extent, but so the November elections that passed, we've seen correct me if I'm wrong, but an unprecedented rise in quote-unquote pro-democracy, in the pro-democracy camp. victories in those elections. Can you explain? Can you kind of talk a bit about that? Explain, like, why does that matter? Why is it something that we should be paying attention, if yes or not, etc.?
I think the media attention on the 2019 Hong Kong District Council elections was actually quite over-optimistic and exaggerated, and that kind of stems from a basic lack of understanding of the Hong Kong political system. Because even though the election saw first like an unprecedented contesting of all of the constituencies, of which there are 452. Yeah, there's 452 constituencies, and I think most of them, if not all, were contested. And the pro-democracy camp broadly like won an incredible majority, and also there was an unprecedented turnout. At the end of the day, the district councils don't really have much power. They basically the councillors basically sit on committees where they discuss the livelihood issues of Hong Kongers, but there is no real power to create policy. It's mostly the implementation of existing policies that are devised for them by the Legislative Council, which is a different council and whose elections are happening this year, likely in September if there's no delay. So in one respect, the district council elections were very important because they were basically a litmus test for the strength of the pro-democracy, kind of protest movement majority, because basically one of the arguments of the pro-establishment camp was that there is this amorphous, like, silent majority that secretly did not support the protests at all and wanted them to end. But this result laid to rest this idea and showed that actually it's not just young people, it's not just protesters, it's not just like particular groups of people in society who support the protest movement, but actually a massive majority. But at the same time, like Hong Kongers themselves, we know that it's a very limited victory within a very like flawed system. If any election is important, it's going to be the Legislative Council elections this year, because if the elections return a pro-democracy majority, then they will actually have the power to like veto repressive laws. And there are many like laws in the works, such as like the dreaded National Security Law, Article 23, that triggered mass protests in 2003. There's fears that it may be reintroduced because of the protests, and a pro-democracy majority will be able to counter that. Also, like big infrastructural projects, like this plan to like build a new island and reclaim the land, which is obviously terrible and for the environment, but also completely unfeasible and economically detrimental to the city. But at the same time, like even if a pro-democracy majority is returned by the series of elections, it can be easily negated, which is what happened in 2016, which was the last series of elections, because the government basically disqualified 6 lawmakers on the basis of a like made-up technicality, and then reduced the pro-democracy camp's majority so that it didn't exist anymore. And then it was able to like push through this extradition bill. So it's all within this, like, I think elections in general are a very like limited sphere of globalization for Hong Kongers, because we recognize that the system within which we exist is already so flawed and structurally problematic. And this is not even to mention like the whole like functional constituencies where particular professions like financial industries have a greater proportion of say in financial members of the financial services industry have a greater say over who gets to represent them and how many representatives they have in the functional constituency system than, say, like teachers. That aside, like the electoral system is just fundamentally very flawed, and it's easy for the Western media and for media in general to latch on to so-called successes in electoral politics as a sign of a success, but I think Hong Kongers are a lot more cynical of that.
Okay, well, I mean, it's unfortunately inevitable. You did mention it in the beginning that the coronavirus epidemic has reduced numbers, at least temporarily. Mm-hmm. I've seen some articles, including, if I'm not mistaken, on Lausan about, I mean, besides the I guess, inevitable panic that we've been seeing among people, which, is a global thing, it's been manifesting itself, at least in some cases in Hong Kong, with this anti-mainland Chinese xenophobia. Mm-hmm. How are activists, anti-authoritarians in general, and others, how are they trying to navigate this problem and tackle it?
I guess I first have to say that this has been a very difficult conversation, even in my personal experience, mm-hmm. because it's entangled with so many threads of discussion. Like, there's the legitimate public health concerns and the efficacy of containment and quarantine measures that we don't know except by counterfactual arguments. And of course, like, racialized health discourses. But on the other hand, also like legitimate trauma from SARS in 2003 and the trauma of basically Hong Kongers being abandoned by their government, given that the government has failed to provide adequate medical supplies to the people and adequate information about what's going on, and basically refusing to listen to medics, like Hong Kong medics' concerns in a legitimate way, such that in my own example, like my family lost someone in SARS in 2003, and then I've been trying to like mail them supplies from abroad because there's just a shortage of everything from like toilet paper to masks, like surgical masks, to antiseptic, like alcoholic sanitizer, because there's just no government supply, and people have had to resort to like international donations and sourcing to rectify something that in a city with an incredible financial reserve and, connections to the world should not be a problem. People shouldn't be like scrounging for, regular medical supplies. Yeah. So I think this whole coronavirus epidemic has been an important, maybe, I guess, litmus test again for what some have called the dark side of the protest movement, like you were saying, anti-mainland Chinese xenophobia, and how anti-authoritarians and leftists and principled supporters of the movement, but also of like a genuine, quote-unquote, revolution of our times in Hong Kong, can actually locate our pain and trauma not in the people who suffer under governments, but the governments and the apparatuses of state violence themselves. Because I think the worst part of this discourse, like internationally about coronavirus, and also in Hong Kong about coronavirus, that has led some shops to like exclude people who speak Mandarin Chinese, or who have perpetuated, like activists, people who have perpetuated really like anti-mainlander xenophobic comments. The effect of all of this is to just obscure the real and like painful suffering of those in the worst affected places, which is in, for example, Wuhan, where people are on total lockdown, like have no access to services, are just trapped in their homes and subject to the whims of like an untransparent government that also has been failing its people. It's not the people in Wuhan's fault that the coronavirus developed in Wuhan, and also that the government, like the Chinese government, failed to enact policies or to contain it properly. And also like the general lack of sympathy for mainland Chinese people who are suffering the brunt of, the effects of coronavirus. Like in the past, a friend was talking to me about how in conditions of natural disasters in China, like the Hong Kong people used to donate, millions of dollars because at the end of the day, it's a humanitarian situation. But this time around, there's very few of that. There's very little of that, and very little sympathy or solidarity with people on the mainland who are resisting the Chinese state's lack of transparency. Like after the death of the doctor who was the whistleblower on the disease, Dr. Li Wenliang, there was this period and ongoing, I think, of resistance, people organizing vigils all around the world to commemorate his death and to issue like 4 demands, including like freedom of speech and expression and, increasing medical supplies to medics. All of this is obscured by this really racialized discourse on public health that necessarily exists with the trauma, but then ignores and obscures the pain and suffering. So I think this is how I've been trying to think about it, which is to locate the trauma and try and find the root of the trauma, which is ultimately state violence. And I think that this is actually it's a quite good example of our general approach, which we use in Lausan, and also I think would be a really good thing for leftists in general and anarchists and people who generally support like anti-authoritarian politics to be like, look, what is the root of our current social, political, economic injustice? It's not each other, but it's the state, and it's the structures that the state uses to divide and rule. It's the impacts of colonialism and imperialism that created structures of racism and economic injustice and exploitation that are the root of why people are getting hurt. And I think the core of all of this is to just remind ourselves that we have to start our analysis where the hurt begins and then try and unpack like the structures that create that hurt. And that's how we have been trying. That's why we at Lausan have been trying to translate lots of pieces around the coronavirus that I can later share, that basically look into like all of these different perspectives about how the outbreak is hurting people, like whether that's female prisoners who are being forced to work overtime to produce surgical masks for who knows who in Hong Kong, or people whose legitimate criticism of xenophobia as a result of the coronavirus outbreak are being suppressed because of this allowance of xenophobic discourses to be aired out as a result of trauma, because trauma is taken to be an excuse rather than a potential explanation that ultimately can't exonerate those points of view. All this to say, like, it's a difficult conversation, but I think it's important, as in with many other things, to remember that it's not people who it's not down to individuals to rectify the ultimate effect of like this nation state and its paranoid authoritarianisms and the structure of capital, which deregulates capital but allows for like and justifies and legitimates the suffering of others for the benefit of the rich and powerful, and that includes like containing people in a particular area, is ultimately the suppression of people. And we have to act against the suppression of people wherever that stands. I don't really know if that made any sense, but
yeah,
it
did. I thought
it there.
I don't know why, but I mean, for some reason it brought me back again to Lebanon, because the recent cases, I think there's 3 or 4 confirmed one in Lebanon so far, have all come from Iran. And so because Iran is not necessarily from Iranians, it could be Lebanese who went to Iran and came back, but because of the specific positionality, I guess, of the Iranian state, which for many Lebanese is viewed through the sectarian lens, that it is itself a promoter of sectarianism and imperialism in Syria and Iraq, and to a certain extent in Lebanon as well, that this has translated itself into, essentially anti-Iranian xenophobia. I see this intersecting a lot with generalized fear, which is not to excuse it in any way, but I'm simply trying to see, for example, that the panic usually starts when people realize that it's not the fact that they're coming from Iran, it's the fact that they're coming from Iran and there's no one at the airport checking them, having basic health checks, which is supposed to be required to prevent the spread of something like the coronavirus. And this just translates itself, instead of anger towards the Lebanese state in this case, which is supposedly the one responsible for the airport, obviously, it gets translated sometimes into anti-Iran xenophobia. And I see this, it is not new, it's preceded, it's not just preceded, it's still continuing, the anti-Syrian xenophobia and racism and anti-Palestinian, which for some is they basically evoke the Civil War days to either accuse Palestinians of all being armed militants or to accuse Syrians of all being secretly part of the Syrian state, which was an occupier in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And it just gets muddled. And the irony, or the tragedy, I guess, is that the vast majority of Syrian refugees in Lebanon are refugees fleeing the Syrian state, the same state that previously occupied Lebanon, the son of the same person. And instead of, the tragedy rather is that, instead of building links with these people who are right now, literally physically in Lebanon, most of whom have been there for several years now, we speak the same language, the potential has been squandered. So I can kind of link it, or a segue to the question I wanted to ask, that one of the point of comparisons as well that I've been seeing between the two movements, of course, there are always lots of differences and, unique contacts and everything. But one point of comparison that I also read this critique on Lausan, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a failure so far, or a limitation anyway, by protesters in Hong Kong, as indeed is the case in Lebanon for that matter, is to include groups like, migrants and refugees in their respective movements. In Lebanon, and I will link these relevant articles in the show notes, and I will find the Hong Kong related ones as well. It has led, some migrants and refugees to feel alienated from the movement. I actually co-wrote an article with a Syrian friend, a comrade, a fellow protester, who in the early weeks was protesting, and then at some point stopped because she felt that the attention on her was too much. Like, she couldn't be too visibly Syrian, if you see what I mean. Like, she couldn't speak Arabic because then you might know from the accent that she's from Syria and not from Lebanon, and that kind of, she becomes hyper visible basically. So she had to, for some time, accept to be the opposite, to be invisible. And at some point, obviously, that demotivated her and she stopped participating. And I heard the same thing from Palestinian friends and from migrant domestic workers, who tend to be Ethiopians, Sri Lankans, Filipinos are the three dominant nationalities, but there are also from other places, and who are, it's a very gendered category because the overwhelming majority of them are women. They have not been included at all. The only time I've seen so far is the few protests by feminists who try to be generally more intersectional, and they would include them in those chants if you want. So yeah, if I can get some of your reflection on this topic, I know it's very difficult, and I'm not really expecting you to tell me, well, this is the solution or anything like that. I'm just curious as to the extent that you've thought about this question. How have you thought about it, and what are some of the maybe conclusions that you've come out with?
I think the main way I've been thinking about the politics of inclusion in social movements is to move away from this more liberal, like multicultural argument for inclusion, which is basically that we need to expand our category of who is a X person. So in our case, who is a Hong Konger, and therefore who is a legitimate interlocutor in the protests. Because I think this logic is still trapped in this broader logic of who belongs, who deserves to belong, and inevitably, if some people belong, then others must not belong. And that's for me a very, it's a bordered logic, of course, because it necessarily separates who's in and who's out, even though it demands a wider version of who's in. And for me, it's also a very carceral logic, because it basically posits the people in the out group as disposable or not necessary or fundamentally beyond redemption.
Yeah.
And in my personal experience, I think that kind of politics is extremely hostile and not helpful, especially in a context where we operate in such a difficult set of circumstances with a shared fate. Our fates are tied together as people living in Hong Kong, a fate that was decided for us and not with us, and in very particular historical circumstances, post-colony, new imperial situations. I don't think reverting to a bordered carceral logic is going to save us. Instead, I've really taken to heart this idea of our slogan for this movement, which has been reclaimed, to be fair, from a pro-independence and often criticized to be somewhat nativist activist, liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our times. I really take seriously this idea of revolution of our times, because I think it encapsulates this need to reimagine our future. And the Puerto Rican scholar and activist, Yarimar Bonilla, basically writes about how imagining a non-sovereign politics, that is like a politics not based on logics of inclusion and exclusion on the nation state, that is instead focused on solidarity on the basis of shared material conditions, is a true future logic that we can aspire to. But also that imagining is an incredible act of courage, because you're basically trying to imagine something into being without it existing yet. And so I think Hong Kongers are on the way to doing this, even though they may fall into settled patterns of existing logics. And that theoretical argument kind of hopefully will shed some light on this example, which is, for example, the movement's interaction with ethnic minorities. So I guess when you asked this question, I was thinking about the Hong Kong protest movement's relationship with basically ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, which are predominantly South Asian, Southeast Asian, migrant domestic workers, refugees, asylum seekers, many of whom have been in Hong Kong for generations, but who have been historically excluded in many respects from the education system, from political positions, from many different structures in society by the majority Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese population, but also the British colonial, white administration up to 1997. At the beginning of the movement, there was not much awareness of the need to involve ethnic minority people. And of course, I'm conscious that even the term ethnic minority is a bit problematic, but that's the term that is generally used rather than people of color or something like that. But there was very little awareness of the need to include ethnic minorities in the movement from the majority Hong Kong Chinese side. Mostly out of ignorance. I don't think out of blatant exclusion, but of course that is in itself a form of racism and exclusion. So there's that. And then basically there were some attacks by triads or like gangs on pro-democracy activists. And some of these were reported to be South Asian people who had enacted these attacks. At the very least, like subcontracted by triads to do so. And so there was this moment where people, potentially agents provocateurs, but also just, I think, people in general, anonymously called on people to like vandalize Chungking Mansions, which is a building made of many shops and restaurants owned by like South Asian, Southeast Asian, African, and other ethnic minority people in Hong Kong. In that moment, it was really interesting because basically lots of Hong Kongers and also ethnic minority Hong Kongers started to interact and to engage in like a dialogue around like racism and how we need to redefine what is a Hong Konger. And then there were some solidarity actions, like people created a Protect Chungking Mansions campaign, and then people at Chungking Mansions like handed out water to protesters. And then soon after, there was a police clearance operation on the protest, and the police used a water cannon against Kowloon Mosque, which is basically the biggest mosque in Hong Kong. In the aftermath of that, many like ethnic Chinese Hong Kongers went and wiped the dye off the mosque, and then there was this another moment of like discussion and like solidarity, and this idea that we need to like protect all Hong Kongers and protect religious freedoms and all of this. And so like if we take back like that theoretical discussion that I had earlier, we can situate this in a broader, like we want to expand this idea of the Hong Konger to include ethnic minorities. But the other perspective is that, as one academic said, basically the identity of Hong Konger has been expanded to include ethnic minorities, albeit sometimes in a tokenistic way. But that has been used against mainland people, like, which is a very weird reversion of the border logic now to include more people, but also to exclude more vociferously other people. And we saw that from like more nativist protests against like people, like women who were alleged to be sex workers, instead of like criticizing the policies that were the root of like these alleged sex workers, like noise nuisance issues. Contingent solidarity is not really solidarity at all, as we know, as like principled activists. And so I think we have to be better at mobilizing, again, against the heart of what causes the suffering that people experience, whether that's extrajudicial attacks or suppression of like freedoms of assembly and association, and just generally look at the source, which is again like state violence and the maintenance of Hong Kong's state of like quote unquote stability and prosperity that necessarily demands no protests and no mobilizations. I want to highlight the case also of the deportation of an Indonesian journalist and migrant domestic worker, Yuli Rizwati, who was detained in horrific conditions in Castle Peak Bay Immigration Detention Center and deported after she reported on the Hong Kong protests. And basically the response to that was quite lukewarm from the general public. And that really showed how contingent, I think, the majority dominant Hong Kong public solidarity is. And I think we can all kind of do better.
Okay, so my last question is the most philosophical one, maybe, I don't know. But you had mentioned this academic that whose book I read and I quite like. So Akbar Abbas, his book is called Hong Kong, Culture and the Politics of Disappearance. And he speaks of Hong Kong as being, and I quote, a port city that used to be located at the intersections of different spaces, which, and I quote again, will increasingly be at the intersection of different times and speeds. So the question of time really interests me here, because There are two dates, especially in the past, that seem fairly relevant. Obviously, 1997 is the big one, and then the other one being 1989 in Tiananmen Square. And a future date, which is 2047, if I'm not mistaken, which is when the one country, two systems arrangement might come to an end. Although, it's argued also that it's already being eroded now, but that's officially when it would come to an end. Can you reflect a bit on the significance of these commemorative dates and even others that I may have missed or that are not talked about as much and they should be, and the generalized feeling of having a sort of quote unquote like an expiry date, 2047. How can that affect the present in the sense of how can it affect the present in the sense of creating this sort of looming existential crisis in a sense?
I think it's a very interesting question that again provides a really important context to the movement. I think the reason Hong Kong people are so invested in this movement fundamentally is because there's a sense in which we're running out of time. I think with every protest movement since the handover, I guess, when the timer was set, the hourglass was flipped on our continued existence as we currently are, every protest movement since has seen this escalated feeling of doom, basically, but also this fundamental reluctance to declare defeat and to be complacent about our rapidly diminishing autonomy existence. There's this story, basically, that I read in a newspaper about the handover recently that really stuck with me. Basically, it was about how on June 30th in 1997, British and Chinese officers, they had to prepare for some flag ceremony for the official handover ceremony. And basically, the British and Chinese event organizers had a massive fight about when this would happen, the logistics of what was gonna who was gonna lower the flag, when the flag would be lowered, the British colonial flag would be lowered, when the Chinese flag would be raised. And this, of course, is important to note that Hong Kong people were excluded out of the negotiations of the handover in 1997, the negotiations happening prior to the joint declaration that was signed in 1984 between the British and Chinese governments. So Hong Kongers were already deprived of a voice and agency. But even in the last moments of this handover ceremony, these proto-nationalist, rituals, British and Chinese officers were still fighting about who would get to do what first and at what time would they do it. And so at the end of the day, there was basically this plan to raise the Chinese flag at immediately midnight, because basically the Chinese side apparently couldn't bear for Hong Kong to be a colony for a minute longer than was agreed in the lease. And Britain had no bargaining power, and so was just okay, sure. And then there was this the article was talking about how there was a plan for the orchestra at the scene to start playing the Chinese national anthem at exactly midnight, and the flags to go up and down at that moment. But then the article goes and says, basically, as a result of some mishap, some mistake, there was a 5-second delay between midnight and 12:05 where nothing happened. Something just went wrong and the schedule was just messed up. And the author was for those 5 seconds, Hong Kong was truly itself. Hong Kong just existed in and of itself, beyond the logics, the colonial temporalities of Britain and China. And I think that moment really stuck with me because it really encapsulated this existence between, on the one hand, the accelerationist tempo of neoliberal financialized capitalism, which Hong Kong was basically always bred to be. This port city, basically a funnel for the world's capital, first for the British Empire and then for China. And on the other hand, Hong Kong's situation between two colonial, national, temporal logics, in the sense that on one hand, when 1997 happened, Hong Kong was abruptly pulled out of the British nation and therefore removed from that national narrative, which it had basically grown up in since the beginning of its existence, after Britain gained the lease to Hong Kong and the new territories. And then Hong Kong was thrown into this other national logic of this progressive integration into Chinese sovereignty through this 50-year period that we're now in. So basically we're trapped in these timelines and tempos of movement that also reflect contemporary geopolitical realities, while at the same time trying to remain firmly rooted in our daily realities of daily life, but also now in this protest movement, rapidly escalating police force, repression, censorship, all these things. And I think all of this fundamentally gives us a very heightened sense of the stakes, because living with an expiry date looming overhead, and I do think that it is an expiry date, really makes people think in very black and white terms and in very all or nothing terms. And it's one of the saddest and most tragic parts of being from Hong Kong and living in the city and feeling committed to it, that we can't ever imagine ourselves beyond these set logics that we never had a part in forming. And of course we can say that, people all around the world have never had a choice in the conditions that they were born in, especially in post-colonial places. And I think in this way, there are many resonances between our situation and those of other struggling peoples around the world. But I think it's a very specific situation that we're in, where we're expected to, as a matter of time, just integrate or be assimilated or to just come under another country's sovereignty. But in this interregnum, I think it's an ample opportunity for us to recalibrate what we see as revolution and liberation for ourselves. Because clearly the sovereign logic of nation states has not served us well. And Hong Kong independence is also not exactly a viable option, but also it's not necessarily a desirable option. I think we have the capacity, and we have shown through this protest movement, through our ability to be self-sustaining and to mobilize in support of one another, even though sometimes that may be flawed, that we have the makings of a political community that can imagine beyond the exclusionary logics of a nation state. And we can really take these logics of mutual aid and solidarity to their full extreme, and thereby reimagine a future for ourselves. And I think that's the thing that is the most exciting and heartening and amazing thing about our movement. And of course, in saying this, I think we have a lot to learn from Lebanese activists, we've discussed previously, but also people who are theorizing forms of existence outside the state and the nation. So, for example, Palestinian activists or Kurdish activists, people all around the world who are imagining ways of being in community without subscribing to bordered carceral logics that ultimately uplift the interests of state and capital. So it's an exciting time, even in the worst circumstances. So
I think that's an excellent way to end this conversation. Thank you a lot, really. Thank you a lot for this conversation.
That's okay. Thank you so much for letting me share my thoughts. I'm really grateful.